Hello everyone, welcome to the third lecture in the SQL series, that is structured query language. And in today's lecture we will be learning about different constraints that are present in SQL, and the constraints that we will be discussing include primary key, foreign key, not null, unique and default constraints. So before delving into the topic and the details of each of these constraints, let us first understand what is exactly a constraint. Constraint is nothing but, in simple English language, it is a restriction. And where are we applying the restriction? The restriction through the constraint is being applied on the values of the attributes. So relational database consists of relations of or tables, and each table consists of vertical columns also known as attributes. Now what are the restrictions that we want to impose on each of these attributes? These restrictions can be defined using different constraints that are provided to you by SQL. Now apart from constraints, there are restrictions, but it is important for you to understand that these constraints are optional, that it is not mandatory, it is not compulsory for you to define any constraint when you are creating your database or creating a relation or table in the database. It is completely up to your choice. Which constraint has to be applied is also your choice, and how many constraints have to be applied on each attribute is also up to the database creator. Okay. Also, what is the need of constraint? You also must know, why do we need constraints? We need constraints so that we can ensure, we can take care that correct data is stored in the database, and that data should fulfill all the conditions that have been imposed on them. So constraints can also be known as conditions that the values of an attribute must satisfy, then only those values will be acceptable within that attribute. So we use constraints to ensure that correct data is stored. Ensure that correct data is stored. Alright, now there are different kinds of constraints. We have to study 5 different kinds of constraint for the structured query language that are provided by the SQL to the user. Okay. Now the first constraint that we will be studying is the not null constraint. So what is the not null constraint? Null basically means that when an attribute does not have a value. Okay, so null means either it implies, this particular value, word null means that the value in that attribute is missing, or the value is specified as NA, that means not applicable, or the value is unknown. Now let me tell you the difference between each of them. Null can be present in an attribute when the value of that attribute exists, but we have not stored the data. Okay, so the value is present. Now let me give you an example before writing this. Say for example, you have a student database, and in the student database you have a table that contains different student details. In that you have the first attribute that stores the student name. This attribute is known as sname. Now in case we have not filled in the name of a particular student, say denoted by row 3, there is a student whose name we have not entered. So in this case the value is not present, but the value exists because there will be no student who has not been given a name by his or her parents. So the value is not present in the database, but the value exists. Okay, but the value exists. Now another just second, but the value exists. So you can note these down. It will be very helpful for you to learn the difference between the two in your for writing in your exam. But the value that is missing actually exists. Okay, similarly, if there is a student whose Aadhaar number has not been stored, or he has not put in or filled in the details of his Aadhaar number, then in that case also, since every citizen has to have an Aadhaar card, so the Aadhaar card exists, the value exists, but has not been filled in and is missing from the database table. The second type is NA kind of values. They are also represented by null values. So NA basically means not applicable. In this scenario, value does not exist. So since the value is not applicable to that particular condition, to that particular scenario, so we have filled in the table, the attribute as null. So an example for this is that if a student is not residing in the university's hostel, then for that student, hostel name is not applicable because the student has not used the university hostel facility. Okay, the third kind is unknown values. In this scenario also, we put null, the word null or the keyword null, into the SQL database tables. Okay, so what do we mean by unknown? Unknown basically means that we do not know whether the value exists or not. We do not know, we do not have an idea if the value exists. So if the student has to fill in the bus number that he is using while coming from home to the university, but that field is left blank by the student, so when the teacher checks the record, the teacher will not be able to understand whether the student is using the bus facility or not, and if he is using, so he or she has not filled in the details. So we do not know if the value exists for sure. Okay, so in this case, we first have to find out that if this particular field is applicable to this scenario, and if applicable, then we'll see how to find out this value. Okay, now this not null constraint, whenever it is applied on an attribute of a table in a relational database, then that particular attribute cannot have any of these three kind of values. That means no value in that particular attribute should be null, and null means in either of the three cases should not be present in that particular attribute. Okay, so this restriction says that you cannot put any kind of null values in an attribute of the table. Now the second kind of constraint that we have to study is the unique constraint. So unique basically means that all the values in the attribute are distinct. Okay, all values of the attribute are distinct. That means they are different from each other. No value is repeated. Okay, so you can write this down that each and every value in the particular attribute is distinct. That means no repetition is allowed when we impose the unique constraint on any particular attribute of a table. Okay, now an example in this scenario can be the roll numbers. In any university, in any class, the roll number cannot be same for any two students, or similarly the employee ID cannot be same for any two people working in the university, right? So these values will always be distinct for each and every individual, each and every entity that is stored in the database, and that is why in such scenarios we utilize the unique constraint. If by mistake the person who is entering the data into the database also enters a duplicate value, then in that case this constraint will not allow that value to be stored in the database. Now the third kind of constraint is the default constraint. So default basically specifies what value will be stored in the attribute if no value has been entered by the user. So if the user has not entered any value, or if the user has not provided any value in the attribute for that particular table of the database, then in that case scenario the default value that is specified will be stored in that particular attribute. So if the user has not specified any value, then store the default value. Default value is the value that is provided by the administrator, the database administrator, while creating the database relations. So for example, we take an example of the student database, and there is in that particular database the table or the relation known as student details, and one of the attributes in this relation student details is nationality. Okay, so in the nationality column we can put a default constraint. Default constraint means that if the student has not entered his or her nationality, by default we'll consider his or her nationality as Indian. So even if the user forgets to write down or mention any value in such an attribute with which we have specified the default constraint, then we need not worry. That value will not be left blank. Rather, the default value that we have specified while designing the database will be put in that attribute in that place. Okay. Now coming to the fourth constraint and the most important constraint, which is the primary key constraint. Primary means main or the first one, right? So primary key constraint, whenever it is applied to an attribute, it ensures that the attribute is able to uniquely identify each and every row in the table. So the attribute which is made the primary key, or the attribute on which the primary key constraint is applied, is able to uniquely identify. Uniquely identify means that with the value of that particular attribute which is declared as the primary key, we can identify and separate out each and every row that is present in the table. So I'll just give you an example. We can uniquely identify each row present in the relation or in the table. Okay. Now again, if we are taking the example of an industry of a multinational company, and we are storing the details of the employees, right? Now there are multiple details that can be stored for each employee. Each row, the horizontal row, gives the details of one particular employee, and each column gives a particular kind of detail, like the employee name. Then the second column can tell you the employee ID. Then the third column can tell you the department in which the employee is working. Now, using the values that are present in the employee ID attribute, we can uniquely identify each and every row or each and every employee that is present in this table, because there might be a scenario when two people working in a particular company can have the same name. So we cannot use the employee name as the primary key, because primary key has to have values such that those values are distinct, are unique for each and every entry. Okay, so it is like the unique constraint, but unique constraint can be applied to more than one attributes also, or two attributes that are not as primary key. But whenever we are designing a relation, a table, we define one attribute that is served as, or that acts as the primary key, and that attribute is such that the values that are present in the attribute will be unique for each and every entry. So we know that employee ID will be unique for each and every employee. The department can be same for two or more employees, because each department will have many employees. So that is why we cannot make the employee department as the primary key. So whichever attribute is designated as the primary key, that attribute must have the values that can uniquely or distinctly identify every row that is present in the table. Okay, now coming to the last constraint that we have to study, and that constraint is the foreign key constraint. Now in the foreign key constraint, what we do is we designate a particular attribute as the foreign key. Now, what does it mean? It means that the attribute that we have marked as a foreign key will only have those values which are present as primary key values in another table. Okay, so let me first write down the definition and then I'll give you the example. So foreign key attribute contains only those values that are present in the primary key of another relation. Okay. Of another relation or another table, whichever word suits you, you can write down your answer in that manner. Now, we just took an example of the employee table. So if we have an employee database in which we have details of employees, right? So this is the employee details relation that is present in the employee database. Okay. The first attribute present in the employee details is employee name. The second attribute is employee ID. And the third attribute is department. Okay. Now, in this particular scenario, if the department, in this particular case, multiple employees can be present in one department. So, department will not be unique in all the entries, okay, because in most of the companies a department has more than one employee. Now, if our employee database also contains a table that stores only the details of the departments that are present in that company, say details like department name, then the head of the department, and the number of employees, the count of employees in that department. Now, in this case, we need not store same department details multiple times. Say if there is in a company, there is the HR department, then there is the engineering department, then there is the logistic department or supply chain department. So each entry will be unique. In this case, this particular table, the department table of the employee database, has dname as the primary key. And why it has the primary key as dname? Because each department will have a different name and each value present in this particular table in the dname column will be uniquely identified by the D name. So if there is one row for HR, there will be no other row in this department table for the HR department name. There will be no other table for the engineering department name, and so on. Now, what is the concept of foreign key? This is the primary key. Okay. Now we have said that when we designate or when we assign a particular attribute of a table as the foreign key, then that attribute can only take values that are present as primary key values in another table. So in our case, we are designating the department DEPT attribute of the employee details table as the foreign key. Now, since it is the foreign key, it is referring to the department table and it is referring to the primary key D name. Okay, so now what does it mean? When the foreign key department is referring to the primary key D name, it basically means that the values that will be present in the department attribute of the eDetails relation, those values will be one out of the three values that are present in the primary key of department, that is the D name. Okay, so let me repeat. The values that are present in the department attribute of the eDetails relation, this particular attribute will only have values that are present in the D name attribute of the department relation. Okay, and in this case, dept is the foreign key, and dname is the primary key. Okay, dname is the primary key for table department, and dept is the foreign key for the table edetails. Okay, so this was all for the today's video. We have learned the different constraints that are possible in the SQL language and how you can define it, what are the examples of it. So thank you for watching. Till we meet in the next video. Mind your exam.